Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording on Tuesday the 29th of July, so as ever, if anything massive happens in the next day or so, that's why we don't cover it. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the developments that have been shaping maritime security, maritime affairs and maritime capability in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So let's dive in. Hi Jen, what have you been up to? What's been keeping you busy over the past week or so?
Hey Richard. Well, it's actually been nearly 2 weeks. I think we're getting into a comfortable 2-week battle rhythm. And we probably should mention that we are, so I guess we're recording this in the midst of Talisman Sabre, which we'll talk about in a bit. We're recording this just after the clashes between Thailand and Cambodia ceasefire has just been announced. We're recording this in the midst of the US AUKUS review, so there is lots happening in the maritime that certainly kept me busy with a lot of media. But I have had a week off as well. I was in WA, drove past Henderson. Just I think as Scott Morrison was saying that he thought Henderson should become a joint US naval base, which is funny until the point that it gains traction in the US and we get pressured on that, then it becomes unfunny. I also whilst I was on leave, much to my wife's delight, I also did a podcast with ABC Nightlife talking about submarines. So I got to do that with Andy Keogh, who now is the Managing Director of Sabre Australia, but has commanded 2 submarines in the Royal Australian Navy. And so we had an anti-submarine warfare officer and a submariner talking about how you find submarines and how you operate submarines. So I'll put a link to the show notes, but I think it was a fairly interesting podcast. It forced me to research some of my history. Did you know, in fact, this is not our did you know, that the first real submarine, now there's a lot of debate about what is a real submarine and when they say this is probably a submersible, but actually 1690, trialled in the Thames in front of one of the kings, whoever was the king at the time. It was a rowboat with a leather cover over it. They sunk it. It was people propelled and then it came back up. They did it 4 times. So anyway, there you go. Evolution of submarines. There's much more to it than that. But look, that's been me. In terms of writing, look, I've had one piece out in the Financial Review whilst I was on holidays, not good at being on holidays, talking about AUKUS again. And this was in response to, look, there's a lot happening with AUKUS and we'll get into it. But a former Secretary of DFAT, Peter Varghese, coming out and talking about, the US-Australia alliance strategy issues broadly. But in his piece, he did talk about the fact that he wouldn't be too upset if AUKUS was cancelled by the US. So I kind of put out a little bit of counter to that we'll put in the show notes. What have you been up to, Richard?
I've been nothing like as productive as you've been, at least not in terms of actually engaging with the public and talking about these kind of things. But we ought to get cracking and start talking about regional developments. And you've already mentioned Talisman Sabre. It is the big story, I guess, of what's been happening over the past couple of weeks. So do you want to dive in?
Look, I think there's been lots happening. It's actually quite difficult to kind of keep track on what the key evolutions are in this Talisman Sabre, who's participating. And I've got to say, I mean, I never really loved Talisman Sabre as an exercise when I was doing it. I always thought it was a little bit overrated. But it has fundamentally changed from the Talisman Sabre that I knew. And the last time I did a Talisman Sabre was probably 2017, 2018. We talked in our last podcast about the size of it. So I've heard different numbers quoted. Sometimes people say 30 or 35,000 or 40,000. It seems to grow as the evolution grows. 19 countries. But either way, the scale of it is huge. 3 weeks. Clearly, we've seen some significant amphibious components of Talisman Sabre, which has always been a hallmark of Talisman Sabre. 2 aircraft carriers, which is quite significant for Talisman Sabre. So the George Washington and the Prince of Wales from the Royal Navy, which we'll talk on probably a little bit later. But I think part of the biggest element of Talisman Sabre has actually been the amount of missile firing conducted during this Talisman Sabre, which is significant from an interoperability perspective, significant from a trust perspective. I mean, you don't normally go to other countries and conduct missile firings around other countries. Now, there's sometimes a syntax during RIMPAC, but often because of the sensitivities about what can be collected on your missiles and that sort of thing. So, what have we seen in terms of missile firings? Look, over the weekend, we saw the Australian Army, in conjunction with the US Army, use one of its HIMARS units, which are only delivered in March this year. So that's pretty rapid integration, to fire a PRISM, so a precision strike missile with a range of over 500 kilometres. Now, that was reported as a co-developed missile. It's not a co-developed missile, but it's hoping to be a co-developed missile. There was an MOU signed with Australia and the US on this in June, and there is some view that hopefully we might be able to produce it in Australia. So I think that precision strike missile firing is pretty significant. Earlier in the exercise, we also saw the US fire an SM-6 from a Typhoon at a maritime target, which is the first time in this region. We've had Typhoon launches deployed to this region since kind of last year during exercise Balakatan as really a signalling response to some of China's behaviour. But this is the first firing, so I think that was quite significant as well. But we've also seen earlier in the exercise, we saw Singapore conducting rocket firings from their HIMARS units. We've seen Japan conducting a firing. I think we talked about that in our last episode in a maritime strike, with a maritime strike capability. We've seen Canada doing Harpoon firings and replenishing their missiles in Darwin. So, I think a range of things happening during Talisman Sabre, but one of the most significant is just the range of missile firings and the demonstration of capability. That's kind of really struck me. What else has been happening? What struck you about Talisman Sabre?
Yeah, I'm kind of building on what you were talking about there, and on some stuff that we talked about last time. I think one of the big things is the range of missile firings, but also the focus on land-based maritime strike missiles. And this is something that we've seen and we've talked about a little bit before, but it really is coming through now. PRISM is going to have, I'm not sure if they're actually delivered yet, but there is going to be a maritime version of PRISM. Obviously, the Typhoon, or Typhoon, never quite sure which,
Who knows?
is in part at least a maritime strike, and this was a strike against a maritime target using an SM-6. The Japanese, again, with their Type 12 launcher. So it really is a kind of a very significant shift in the types of capabilities that are being used, and I think there's some really interesting stuff there in terms of wider kind of impact on the maritime domain. We've also seen some interesting stuff in terms of port visits and kind of wider engagement. So the Prince of Wales was in Darwin, and there was quite a lot made of this. I think it's the first time a British carrier has been in Australia since 1997. So long time, and she's a big bit of kit. And in terms of the imagery and I guess the sort of the signalling, the fact that this tied in with the AUKUS and the announcement that we'll talk about in a little bit of the treaty that was signed, and all of this stuff that kind of linked up, it is quite impressive, and it's quite a clear statement of Australian UK defence ties. So I thought that was obviously interesting. And the other one that really did catch one's eye was the visit of the USS Ohio into Brisbane. The Ohio class submarines are generally seen as the American ballistic missile submarines, so the ones that carry their nuclear deterrent. At the end of the Cold War, 4 of the early boats were decommissioned as nuclear missile carrying boats, and they were converted into carrying a large number, up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. So you can basically put 4 Tomahawks, I think it's 4 Tomahawks into each what was a Trident cell. They are obviously very impressive and very capable platforms in terms of particularly land strike capability, and have been used regularly in terms of American land-based strike. But I think the fact that one of these boats is in Australia, port visit in Brisbane, it is again sort of signalling American engagement, signalling American intent. And I saw somebody was flagging about whether or not it's going to be how long before there's an American SSBN visit to Australia. I would say that was a significant further step, but it is it's a sign of growing American willingness to engage and growing visibility of American defence presence in Australia. So I thought that was quite interesting. What did you make of some of the port visits and the signalling element of this?
Significant. I think that the US contribution to Talisman Sabre has been significant in terms of the size. And one of the other elements that we didn't mention, but I think is significant, we might have foreshadowed it in the last podcast, was the deployment of HIMARS to Christmas Island. So there's some images out there. No, it wasn't fired from Christmas Island. And there was like a little byline in the announcement saying this was cleared by customs. But it was a US... which is actually anyone who's been involved in Talisman Sabre planning would know that the customs and quarantine aspect of Talisman Sabre is actually the biggest bugbear, which causes a lot of grief. But anyway, significant. So it was a US HIMARS. Look, I'm not sure exactly how many HIMARS units Australia has at the moment. We had 2 delivered in March. We're meant to be getting 42. I suspect we probably only have the 2 right now, but that's not entirely clear in the public domain. But this was a US HIMARS unit with Australian Army personnel, overseen by a Navy Commodore, deployed to Christmas Island, rapidly deployed to Christmas Island in a Canadian C-17, in a Canadian C-17. So quite a powerful image. And then allegedly, at least, rapidly removed so it couldn't be counter-targeted. Now, I think that bit is probably... that's an eyebrow-raising comment, but I think this is significant. So think of all the countries involved in that, the rapid deployment to Christmas Island. So that also caught my eye. And I've got to say, as much as when you see press releases about exercises, you always kind of roll your eyes about what they say about their achievements. But this Talisman Sabre is by far above and beyond any other previous Talisman Sabre. And I would say probably one of the most complex multilateral exercises that is conducted in the region. In terms of high-end warfighting, it is another step change on things like RIMPAC. RIMPAC, of course, is a much larger exercise, but actually, certainly my experience of it isn't a high degree of high-end warfighting, but this Talisman Sabre certainly seems to be. So I'm impressed. Tick if you're a Talisman Sabre planner and
it's been really hard almost to keep track of everything that's going on, right? I mean, even one of the other things that I think has been quite notable is that, yes, there's obviously a very large American presence, and there's sort of Australian, American, and then others. But there's also been some more Australian bilateral stuff with other partners from the region. There was an amphibious exercise with South Korea, and so you're just seeing the full kind of gamut of things taking place, but more, I guess, high-end and more capable elements and components taking place not only with the Americans. There obviously is this huge American presence, but also a lot of stuff with other partners from the region as well. So it does seem to be a real step on and hugely complicated. Trying to piece it all together.
It does. I was trying to get a list of all of the participants in terms of units, but I couldn't find one. The one thing I would note, and really is just a passing comment, certainly in the press releases and the conduct, the Royal Australian Navy seems to feature a lot less in this Talisman Sabre than in previous. It looks like Sydney has participated in half of it, but it's beyond Sydney's participation half. I mean, there must be some more participation. It's not entirely clear, and that might be just a byproduct of the state of the fleet at the moment, which we'll talk about a bit later when we talk about the good news that HMAS Parramatta is back in the water.
One other thing which I think is definitely worth flagging in terms of things that have been happening in the region, and that is, and I have no idea quite how you're supposed to pronounce this, but Operation Nasse, I'm going to go with, which was has recently wrapped up. It was an operation to combat IUU fishing in the Pacific. It was driven largely, I guess, the coordination center was hosted by the US Coast Guard. It was sort of supported by Australia, France, New Zealand, and the United States, but working alongside a set of Pacific Island partners, including Tonga, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. And it's covered a huge area and across quite a wide period of time, and has resulted in a number of interceptions and boardings, and I guess a significant presence in terms of the response to IUU fishing, and a step up in terms of international support for regional partners and kind of international cooperation across what is obviously a hugely challenging problem to try and counter, because of the kind of the transitory nature of it, because of the lack of visibility, because of the lack of resources of a lot of those involved. So really interesting little exercise to see, operation to see that taking place, and something that I guess doesn't normally get a huge amount of attention.
It doesn't, and I mean, I was quite interested in this. Two reasons. One, look, certainly, I'm hearing some commentary about, there was a huge push for US Coast Guard presence in the Pacific in the last couple of years. I'm hearing some commentary that that's kind of reduced, but certainly we're still seeing these activities. So how much of that is true? How much of that is not? It's kind of hard to tell in the public domain. But the other point that I thought was really interesting is the Australian participation. So the Australian participation in this was not a Royal Australian Navy or an Australian Border Force vessel. It was actually a New South Wales Police Force vessel, which made me do a little bit of a deep dive into New South Wales Police Force maritime capability, which is not that great. But, I mean, they referred to it as an OPV, an offshore patrol vessel, OPV Nemesis, which they have one of. It was commissioned nearly 20 years ago. In fact, earlier this year, I did deep dive this, you can tell. The New South Wales government actually announced that they're going to, they've allocated funds to replace the OPV. It was built in Henderson. It's not an OPV as we know an OPV. I mean, when we talk about the OPVs, we're talking about things like the Arafura class, which is about 1,600 tonnes. The Nemesis vessel is about 100 tonnes, which is kind of the fifth of the size of an Australian Navy patrol boat. But I thought that was interesting, that the New South Wales police force is actually out in the Pacific, working on illegal fishing with some of the Pacific Islanders, because yes, the states do have responsibility for some elements of the maritime domain. New South Wales Police Force, it says, out to the end of the exclusive economic zone on the New South Wales coast. That's actually not entirely true, but we don't talk about it very much. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit as well.
I absolutely picked up on the same tidbit, and it made me think about the wonders of the Australian Civil Maritime Strategy and GAMSA, and all of the incredibly complicated arrangements for kind of jurisdiction and stakeholders in Australian civil maritime relations and civil maritime security. So yes, absolutely an interesting one and an interesting element within that. We've already presaged it slightly, and we cannot go through one of these podcasts without talking about it. So let's talk about AUKUS. I think you ought to fire away as the person who is firing most of the shots on AUKUS. So do you want to kick off, and we'll take it from there?
Sure about that. It's funny. I remember sitting in. I was in uniform when AUKUS was announced, and I was sitting in Force Design, which you'd think we would have been responsible for AUKUS, but we were certainly not. But that's an aside point. And I remember when it was announced, we got a heads up that it was about to, something significant was about to be announced anyway. And I said, gee, if I was the Prime Minister or the Chief of Navy, I probably wouldn't have made that decision. And I kind of stand by that. But my rationale, as I've said a number of times in this podcast, is not because SSNs aren't a great decision for Australia, because I think they are. It's more because I concern about, the impact on the Navy in terms of the other functions the Navy needs to undertake, and surface combatant force and all of that, and the workforce issues. But I think we've moved well beyond that. So what's happened in AUKUS? A couple of things have happened. As we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we're still in the midst of this mythical US review. I say mythical because we don't really know anything about this US review. It's clearly happening. It hasn't been announced by the Department of Defense and Pentagon. It was announced through a series of leaks, and as we've said on previous podcasts before, you've got to kind of take leaks with a grain of salt in terms of there's something there, of course, where there's smoke, there's fire, but people leak things for different reasons and for their own kind of politics. Over the weekend, we saw some reporting in The Australian. They did an interview, I think, with Representative Joe Courtney in the US, who is on the subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee that's focused on shipbuilding. He's a big friend of Australia, a big friend of AUKUS. He was expressing frustration that even the Congress can't seem to get the terms of reference of what this AUKUS review actually entails. So there does seem to be a lot of confusion and a lot of chaos might not be the right term. I'm not there, but just certainly a lot of confusion about what the AUKUS review is actually focused on. The initial reporting from the leaks, and we're going back a month and a bit now, said it was a 30-day review. It's clearly not a 30-day review. It's clearly still ongoing. And it's not clear that we'll even know when the review is finished or what the outcome necessarily is. The other development, which is probably more significant for Australia, is the signing of the Geelong Treaty. So for those that aren't based in Australia, our Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, is our Defence Minister, and he is from Geelong. Now, Geelong actually is significant in our naval history as well. During World War II, Geelong built a whole bunch of mines. But for some unknown reason, the AUKUS Treaty was signed in Geelong, so it's a bilateral treaty between Australia and the UK. It was actually announced in September last year when Miles and Lloyd Austin were in the UK for trilateral talks. I just mentioned that because I've seen in the reporting over the weekend that this is a direct response to the US review, but it's been a treaty that's been negotiated for 9 months. And some people said, well, it was announced because of the AUKUS review. No, it was announced to coincide with AUKMIN. AUKMIN was scheduled to coincide with Prince of Wales visiting, which was probably scheduled 12 months ago. So I put some. That's unlikely. I was even asked a question of, do you think the US will get upset that Australia's agreed this treaty with the UK? And I'm like, no. So what does the treaty look at? We don't know exactly. It probably, from my understanding from talking to some people, it focuses predominantly probably on phase 3, which is the co-development, co-design of SSN AUKUS and then the build in the UK in Australia. And then some elements of phase 1 in terms of, certainly under phase 1 at the moment, at least on paper, there's meant to be an astute class rotating out here from 2027. The reason I say at least on paper is the UK just doesn't have a lot of submarines. So that's going to be a challenge for him. But it deals with a lot of the workforce issues and things like that. So I think it's good. It certainly reinforces the UK's commitment to AUKUS, which of course they would be. I mean, certainly in their national interests for a lot of reasons. Cost sharing predominantly is one. So that's good. It was kind of announced to coincide with AUKMIN, and there wasn't much else really out of AUKMIN, but it was a big show of force coinciding with the Prince of Wales visit. And some comments from the UK Foreign Minister David Lammy that it demonstrates that the UK is ready to fight in the Pacific. I'm paraphrasing, which is a little bit. I certainly wouldn't expect in the event of a major conflict in the Pacific that the UK would have the capacity to focus on the Pacific. They need to be focused elsewhere. The third development that we do need to talk about in AUKUS is also we spoke about this earlier in the year. The previous Chief of Naval Operations was sacked in January, February. Lisa Fresnetti, not really clear why she was sacked, something to do with equity and diversity, first female Chief of Naval Operations for the US Navy. The nominee, Admiral Caudle, is currently going through his congressional hearing process to be confirmed by the Congress, and he sat down with the Armed Services Committee of the Congress last week. Now, in that, there's quite an interaction about AUKUS. He talks about his concerns on US submarine industrial base, and the fact that really to support the AUKUS commitment, the US needs to get to 2.3 Virginia-class submarines a year. And he certainly does not sound positive about the US's ability to do that. There is an interaction with the Congress, and he says, I certainly commit to getting us up to that standard. It's certainly worthwhile reading. We'll put a link in the show notes to the transcript or at least the video of it. I think that's significant as well. It's certainly got a lot of reporting in the US and certainly causes some concern in Australia, rightfully so. I mean, there is a risk and there is concern, and the messaging coming out of the US with respect to phase 2 of AUKUS is not helpful, and this is also not helpful. But I do think, and my last kind of point on AUKUS before I hand to you, I always say I'm sick of talking about AUKUS, is it does need to be read within the context of that congressional hearing. So you've got the nominee for C&O, his predecessor was sacked for not clear reasons. A number of senior leaders have been sacked. There's a Pentagon review on AUKUS. He's not going to step out ahead of that and say incredibly positive things about AUKUS. That would not put him in a good position. There's also the issues with shipbuilding and submarine building, which is a hugely political issue in the US. It really does need congressional support, to be honest with them, to solve it. They need to create more efficient public shipyards and develop more public shipyards. And so he's not going to say that he doesn't have an issue with submarine building or shipbuilding. The Armed Services Committee, that is headed by Senator Wicker, who is a big fan of AUKUS, is quite influential in this. And so he's, it's kind of in his interest. I'm not saying AUKUS isn't at risk. I mean, there is clear messaging here that there is some issues with phase 2. But it's in his interest to say that, AUKUS is at risk and there's issues with submarine industrial base. There's also this political context to it. So I think it all needs to be read in that context. So they're kind of the three developments on AUKUS. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that the discussion around the Geelong Treaty, I guess that the other element of this, of course, is that for those outside of Australia, Richard Marles is a huge Geelong Football Club, AFL football fan, obsessively so, and so I was almost surprised that the treaty wasn't signed on the pitch of the Geelong footy stadium. But I thought that a lot of that was kind of overblown in the media. It's clearly from what we know, and we don't know a lot, but it is clearly about making real the and putting in place the structures to enable both the rotation of an astute through Western Australia, and then primarily about phase 3 SSN AUKUS, and lots of the legal and even down to things like the fueling and what happens to the fueling at the end of life cycle, all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of practical elements to this, and I don't see anything. I don't read too much into the tea leaves in that regard. I would, however, flag that, and you put it very nicely, that there are still very significant challenges. So I think in some ways this is a really good thing in terms of the UK AUKUS relationship or engagement with AUKUS. But I still think that there are some huge challenges. You've only got to look at some of the recent commentary and stories coming out of the Royal Navy to understand those challenges. There's reporting that currently the UK does not have a single SSN available, let alone one available to be able to be deployed to Western Australia or the Indo-Pacific more generally. There are massive issues in terms of funding and maintenance cuts and availability across a whole range of different platforms. And whilst there has been talk of significant increases in defence funding, I think that there are still major question marks over whether or not any of that will actually transpire. So I think there are still real questions around the UK's engagement with AUKUS. I would absolutely agree with you that I think it is, broadly speaking, in the UK's national interest, but I don't think that. I think we need to see sort of both sides of that coin. In terms of the CNO's comments, I don't think that they are in any way surprising. I would absolutely agree with you about the political context. I would also add that again, this is kind of reading between the lines and from what you hear from different people, but there's been a strong constituency within the US Navy that has not been particularly fond of the idea of transferring submarines to Australia from the get-go. And there's been significant indications that considerable pressure had to be put onto the US Navy to get them to kind of get on board with AUKUS. So whether or not there are elements of that dynamic playing out, we often think about, well, what's the American position on AUKUS? Well, there isn't an American position on AUKUS, right? There's the submariners within the US Navy will have a position, the nuclear reactor crew, or the nuclear mafia will have a position. Everyone has got their own kind of dynamics within it. And so I suspect there's elements of that playing out as well. So I don't think there's actually been, as ever, a huge amount of change, but I think that we're seeing elements of the concern being played out more openly. I guess maybe the American AUKUS review has given cover for people to perhaps be a little bit more open in their questioning of AUKUS than perhaps they might otherwise have been. Anyway, I think we've probably talked enough about AUKUS.
We
or do you
have,
want to jump back in?
Well, I'll just make two.
Go for it.
I mean, I agree with you. I guess, as kind of said initially when the optimal pathway was announced in 2023. I mean, what you do know about that plan is nothing will go exactly to that plan, right? And there will be changes. Some of those changes might be fundamental. And I do think, though, and this kind of gets to the heart of the piece that I put in the Fin review, that if we can get through this, and I don't think anything's actually, I mean, the submarine industrial base issues existed when the optimal pathway was announced. The things changed in Washington is who holds sway over some of the politics of it. But if we can get through this, then actually what you have is, between the three partners, a strengthened submarine industrial base by getting to phase 3 of AUKUS. But it's even once we get through the US review and the next bit, it will be a bumpy ride until we get to that point. I just think that Australia could be a little bit more stoic on some of the reporting around it to just ease the anxiety. That's not our tradition, but it would be helpful.
Come on, it'd do you out of a job, right? You wouldn't be on the media every 5 minutes if there wasn't hair pulling and dreadful stories. So
that's true. I'd be happy to make that sacrifice for a stable discussion on Australian defence capability. But anyway, all right, we do need to move on. What's next? What else are we going to talk about?
So I guess very quickly, in terms of AUKUS Pillar 2, there's been some bits and pieces that have come out of, or sort of part of, I guess, Talisman Sabre, that fit into the AUKUS Pillar 2 umbrella. In particular, and I'm going to put this in just to annoy you, there's been another element or iteration or something of Maritime Big play, which is the kind of I guess testing and operationalization of uncrewed vessels, both uncrewed surface and uncrewed underwater vessels, and the development of joint C2 systems or integrated or C2 systems that can at least communicate with each other between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And Japan has also been a sort of party to this and was an observer as part of this Maritime Big play. I think they were an observer at one of the previous ones.
They were an Autonomous Warrior last year. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And they were also testing out some of their... they've been working for a little while now on underwater acoustic communications, and they've been doing some quite exciting stuff, and they were testing out some of that as part of this. But I just had to get in the Maritime Big play just to annoy Jen. What else has been going on, Jen?
Well, it annoys me because he's the worst name for an exercise in the world, and I said that on national TV last year, and a clip of that was sent to the person who came up with that name, whom I know personally. I stand by the comment. It is the worst name for an exercise in the world, with certain innuendos that is not appropriate for some of our audience, so we won't go into that. I love that we're communicating about this, because there's not, there's a dearth of information about what's happening under AUKUS Pillar 2. But I've got to say, and no offense if you wrote the press release, it doesn't actually make any sense. Like, when you read the press release, you're like, what did they do? They did something. What they actually did also seems to confuse remote control with autonomy. Isn't clear. So something happened on AUKUS Pillar 2 relating to UUVs and passing control. Japan observed. What that something was, not clear, and that's quite a long press release. But anyway, other things happening. Indonesia. So look, we've talked a bit about this, and probably in one of our episodes we probably need to do a bit of a deep dive, because it's really not clear what's happening with Indonesia's naval modernisation. And we mentioned in a previous podcast that one of the biggest constraints on Indonesia in terms of modernisation of capability is their defence spending, which sits roughly around 1%, a little bit less of GDP. And a large swathe of that actually still goes towards land capability. And then also a lot of it is kind of spread because they have a strategy of acquiring different bits from a range of different countries. And we kind of see this again. So there's been an announcement at the IDEF, which is a defence capability symposium, really, that Indonesia is going to acquire 2 Turkish frigates. They're called the Milgem Istef class frigates. I apologise if I pronounce that incorrectly. Look, this is an evolution of a capability that Turkey's been kind of operating since the early 2000s. This is kind of the new iteration. In many ways, in terms of the capability, it really sounds a lot like an Anzac class. So it's about 3,100 tonnes, it's about 130 metres long. It's a CODAG, so combined diesel and gas propulsion system, 16-cell vertical launch system, some air defence capability, 76mm naval gun, so different to an Anzac in that way, and a close-in weapon system with, as you can imagine, appropriate radars, a hull-mounted system, etc. So it's been announced that Indonesia is going to acquire 2 of these. Not sure what time frame, but that's interesting. 2 of a class, though, can be unhelpful when it comes to sustainment and a bunch of different things, sustainment training, etc. And in fact, I'm working with the UNSW Naval Studies Group, to give UNSW a plug, so is Richard, on a maritime strategy book, monograph, that'll come out later in the year, that actually one of the elements and recommendations that talks about one of the problems with Australia's fleet design is the just large array of platforms and the issue with the lack of commonality and what that's meant for our fleet and what it will mean into the future. Also, is this a development? I don't know, but on the theme of Indonesian naval modernisation, Naval Group have put out a release saying that the contract between Naval Group and Indonesia for Indonesia to acquire 2, so again 2 of a class, Scorpene submarines, has come into force in the last couple of weeks. So this was signed in mid-July. They're going to be built and commissioned in Indonesia, which is interesting. In terms of submarine building in Indonesia, again, not clear on the time frame. So, look, certainly Indonesia is pushing forward this naval modernisation. There's a bunch of other things that we've spoken about before. We talked about the potential Indonesian bid for the retired or decommissioned Italian aircraft carrier to turn that into a drone carrier. So there's a range of things happening, and we probably should do a bit of a more comprehensive deep dive. Any comments on Indonesia's naval modernisation?
I find it incredibly confusing.
Me too.
I don't really understand a lot of the logic behind elements of it. As you say, 2 Turkish frigates, 2 French submarines, range of other things that are being discussed, an aircraft carrier over here. I really struggle to see a coherence behind it. I will add that I am absolutely not all over the internal kind of debates in Indonesia in terms of their kind of defense approach. Although talking to people who are much more plugged in into TNI and more broadly into the Indonesian sort of defense and security picture, I think that there are big questions about kind of quite what is going on, how it all fits together, and I think we still need to see how because there was quite a lot of focus on a maritime and archipelagic strategy under the previous president, and how that then plays out under the current president. So I think that lots of questions, certainly from my end, and relatively few answers. I would be surprised if all of these acquisitions come off. And I suspect even if they do, there will be significant issues in trying to maintain and operate these capabilities. But that's maybe the cynic in me coming out again.
No, you're entirely correct. And I mean, the issues that we're going to experience when we have two classes of frigates, another class of destroyer, etc., etc. Speaking of frigates, HMAS Parramatta. Some good news about HMAS Parramatta. Do you want to share the good news?
Yep. So HMAS Parramatta is back in the water. So she's just been through the AMCAP, which is the ANZAC Midlife Capability Assurance Program. So this is the major upgrade which has taken place in terms of the ANZAC class frigate capability. This has sort of significantly enhanced the capability of the vessels, including installation of CFAR L-band radar and further kind of updates. And in fact, I think that this upgrade has included the installation of NSM, so Naval Strike Missile, onto Parramatta. So there's still further bits of the upgrade to go, and kind of trials and certification before she's back with the fleet. But this should happen relatively soon. I think it's planning in early 2026. So it'll be good to get Parramatta back operational again, and I guess it also speaks to the kind of the length of process that this is the midlife capability assurance program at a time when these vessels are, I think it's fair to say, sort of pushing towards the end of their lifespan. And there was intended to be obviously a further upgrade as part of Transcap, which was cancelled under the Surface Fleet Review. But it is, I guess, it's a good sign, but it's not going to be enough to plug holes, I think, that are very much appearing in the Australian surface fleet, which I suspect is where you're just about to go to. But
yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, well, look, it is good to see Parramatta back in the water. Obviously, not complete the Transcap, the AMCAP, which is, Parramatta's been in for 3 years. I mean, I'm not sure it was planned to take 3 years. Look, this has been an interesting process. Certainly, lots of good upgrades, but I think there's kind of been forced into this delayed process in a way. I mean, ANZAC went through the AMCAP in 2020. I found a figure somewhere for how much the AMCAP is estimated to cost. It was look, I might be wrong, and if you work on the AMCAP and I get it wrong, certainly the original budget that I saw was 200 million per ship. That's clearly blown out. ANZAC was upgraded in 2020, and then ANZAC was decommissioned in 2024. So look, I think there is this issue. We've talked about it in terms of this future planning of the fleet. It's been going on for a long time. A lot of it comes to do with really delayed government decisions, which have gotten us into this position. It looks like Parramatta will actually come back online just as we're preparing for a run to decommission. You mentioned the Transcap, which was going to be a further upgrade. Interestingly, the Surface Combatant Fleet Review actually recommended that Transcap went ahead, but the government said, no, it's not worth the money because of the age of frigates. And I've got to say, without being across the details of any of that, it probably feels like a good call, to be honest. In terms of the surface fleet, look, we are in a big bind. And I mentioned, that it did seem to be, from all the reporting about Talisman Sabre, that there didn't seem to be a huge Royal Australian Navy contribution. I'm sure there was a huge people contribution. Now, happy to be corrected on that point, but there just weren't a lot of Royal Australian Navy ships featured in it in the same way that there normally is featured in the press reporting. Sydney was featured. I think Choules was featured. There must have been at least another frigate out there. And this just really shows there's the stress on the fleet. Now, how do we solve the stress on the fleet? So the government solution is the general purpose frigate, which is still in its down select to 2. There are rumours abounding in Canberra that the decision is going to be made in the next week or so, and potentially announced straight after that. But who knows what might actually happen there? And to be honest, who knows what the decision is going to be? I don't think, I actually don't think in the public domain it's actually clear what either of the bids actually entail. Which makes it really hard to kind of provide any assessment on that. But that's meant to be discussed. And of course, all of this comes in the background of not only the service combatant pressure and challenges, but we talked about in the last podcast the ANAO audit on the LHDs that have questionable operational availability based on that ANAO audit. Certainly, I haven't seen any reporting, but it certainly sounds like that both of the tankers are still unavailable. Just based it on the fact that I suspect we would see some reporting if they were available. We're talking about the issues of the mine warfare fleet. There's one left. There's one hydrographic survey vessel left, and the list kind of goes on. And so we really, even when the general purpose frigate announcement is made, and if that is in a couple of weeks, great. There's still a wide range of issues in terms of the Royal Australian Navy's capability that, I'm just not sure will be addressed anytime soon. So it is a huge challenge.
Well, that is a depressing note. I think on that depressing note, we ought
news. Getting new ships.
We ought to begin to draw this episode to a conclusion, because we've probably taken more than enough time, as ever.
So I'll just flag that we talked about it the last podcast, but I just want to flag again that the Chief of Navy essay competition, which is being managed by the Australian Naval Institute, has been announced. We'll put a link in the show notes to the Australian Naval Institute's website. But there's 4 divisions. There's a good prize money. I mean, it's $2,000 per division. I think that's good prize money for what is effectively a 2,500 word essay. So there's an open division. Anyone can apply to that. There's an Australian Defence division that's aimed at just members of the Department of Defence. There's a Navy under 25 division. So if you're a young naval officer or sailor under 25, you really should be shooting for this. And there's an industry division. So look, certainly we see a lot of great essays come through that. So I'd encourage you to have a look. We do have a Did You Know. We will get called out for abandoning the Did You Know, but we are well past time. So we'll save the Did You Know for another time. We'll eventually one day get to our Did You Know about the ANZUS Treaty, which is often quoted and often misunderstood. Anyway, Richard, we probably should wrap things up. Now, I just want to say before we wrap things up that this sounds really corny, but everyone else does at the end of the podcast. I feel like we should do it. So, if you enjoyed today's episode, if you didn't, then just thanks for your time. Move on. You probably didn't make it to this point in the recording if you didn't like it. But if you do happen to like it, then please like, subscribe, share, etc. It does actually help us in terms of the production of the podcast, and great to see the episode getting a lot more likes and views. So I'll wrap it there and say thanks so much, Richard.
Thanks a lot. As ever, remember, guys, maritime matters.
That's so corny. All right, thanks, Richard.
Cheers.